Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering great weapons, the highest damage weapon category in the game. We're covering great axes, great clubs, great swords, and mauls, the greatest hits, as it were, of Baldur's Gate 3's weapons, which are usually used by fighters, barbarians, and paladins, as well as a number of other classes, to do overwhelming damage in melee combat. There's a couple two-handed weapons that aren't included in this tier list. Versatile weapons will be in their own list upcoming, and polearms and staffs I've already covered in previous tier lists as well. So we're going to focus on the weapons that are designed for incredible melee damage when wielded in two hands. Just as with my previous weapon and item tier lists, I'll be rating these weapons based on their power level at the point in the game at which you acquire them. So, in other words, are they better than the equipment you currently have access to? Should you pick up this weapon, and should you use it? In S tier, I'm going to be placing weapons that are best in slot for a wide variety of builds, or specific very powerful builds. In A tier, weapons that make interesting alternatives to the S tier weapons, enabling unique or cool strategies. In B tier, weapons that are useful for, like, one or two encounters in the game, or specific very niche strategies. In C tier, weapons that most parties won't have a use for, but in certain very unusual circumstances, you might be able to use this weapon for a specific kind of party composition. And in D tier, weapons that are typically outclassed by other options, so will not be particularly useful for most parties. Finally, before I begin, I do want to take one quick moment to say thank you so much to Joe Mo for the €10 donation, RSGE for the €10, Doug NYC for the $10, and Gerald Kennedy and Chris Klug for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support. Really means a lot. Alright, let's talk weapons. People have said they've enjoyed the historical asides I've sometimes thrown in about these weapons as we've gone through the tier lists, so let's take a brief moment to talk about the history of these two-handed weapons. While these were definitely real weapons that saw use in battlefields around the world throughout various periods in history, they were, in fact, much rarer than you might think given their extreme prevalence in fantasy and in historical fiction. A lot of the examples that we have of this kind of weapon were ceremonial or decorative rather than actually practical. So while they were in fact used in battle and not tremendously uncommon, they're much rarer than their depiction in movies and so on. There's a pretty simple reason for this. Once you have a weapon that is so heavy and large that it needs to be wielded in two hands, it's very low cost at that point to put a long shaft on it and have it become a polearm, which is a more practical weapon for almost every circumstance. Polearms have longer reach, meaning that you can hit enemies from further away, and greater leverage, so you can hit much harder than with these shorter two-handed weapons. So these were definitely used, and you can find examples of them throughout various periods of history, but they actually were less frequently used than many of the other kinds of weapons depicted in Baldur's Gate 3. I will say that as a weapon type, this makes a little more sense for a fantasy adventurer than for a historical fighter, because in Baldur's Gate or in other fantasy settings, you would probably much more often be fighting in cramped quarters, in caves and so on, because you're delving into the underground to attack monsters, whereas most historical battles took place in open areas on battlefields. So having a weapon that you can swing that's really, really heavy and hits really hard, but doesn't require a whole ton of space, might make a little more sense for a fantasy warrior than for an actual historical soldier. But one of the interesting things about these weapons, given how prevalent they are in fiction, is that they weren't that prevalent in history. I'm going to start by discussing the base stats and special weapon actions available to each of these four kinds of weapons. If you're not interested in that, then of course feel free to skip ahead to the Blooded Greataxe, the first of the magical weapons that we'll be talking about, but I think it's very useful to understand the basic abilities available to each of these weapons when you're evaluating them. We're going to start with the Greataxe. Greataxe is a two-handed martial weapon that does a d12 of base damage, so very high base damage, and has three special weapon actions available to it. The first of these is Lacerate, which we've talked about in a bunch of other tier lists. Lacerate lets you once per short rest, force an enemy to make a con save or become bleeding, which gives them disadvantage on con saves, and then 2 additional damage every turn. Lacerate's a fairly weak weapon action overall, so it's not one I highly value as a base weapon action for one of these weapons, but useful if you're trying to land a Constitution save targeting debuff. Secondly, they have Cleave, which lets you hit up to 3 enemies for half your base weapon damage. Cleave is actually incredibly useful on one of these great weapons, because the characters that want to use this kind of weapon will do tons of damage, so the ability to hit 3 enemies for half of their damage, that gives them quite a lot of additional damage output possibilities if you're facing a lot of enemies, and since overkill can be a problem for characters using these kinds of weapons, the ability to avoid overkill by cleaving multiple enemies is really useful. In addition to that, the way that Cleave works is it only halves the base damage of your attacks. If you have damage that gets added to your attacks from, for example, Great Weapon Master, which almost every character using this type of weapon is going to have, that will get added in full, so it'll do the full 10 bonus damage from Great Weapon Master to all 3 enemies, which means that Cleave can vastly improve the amount of damage that your characters are doing, so really useful weapon action to have. Finally, Great Axes have Prepare, which is very similar to Brace that polearms and longbows have, letting you spend 20 feet of your movement speed to deal an additional strength modifier of damage on your next, on every attack for the rest of that turn. So without spending an action, you get to double your strength mod to damage with every attack made that turn. That's huge. Obviously, characters that are using this kind of weapon will have very high strength scores, so that's going to be plus 5 damage on all of your attacks made in a given turn, which is an incredible bonus to be able to activate for something that doesn't cost an action to use. Using your movement speed, of course, is a real cost, but the amount of additional damage that you get from the Prepare weapon action is incredible. So Great Axe at its base has a really good chassis for a weapon. The Great Axes on this list get a lot of really nice bonuses. Great Axe is also notable for one other reason, which is that it is a barbarian's starting weapon, meaning it's the highest damage weapon that you can start the game with. So it will be useful in the early game if you started as a barbarian to have a non-magical Great Axe, because it lets you do way more damage than any other character can do on the Nautiloid. Between the Prepare weapon action, the Cleave effect making AoE damage easier, and just the high base damage of the weapon, it makes you much better at killing enemies on the Nautiloid before you get access to other good weapons. So the Great Axe actually has some pretty useful properties because you get access to it so early. For that reason, I'm going to give it B tier. Obviously, we're going to want to switch out of it as soon as possible, but the Great Axe is actually an excellent weapon because you can start the game with it. The Great Club is a simple weapon, so you don't have to have martial weapon proficiency to use it, and it does a D8 of damage, and also has 2 special weapon properties. The first of these is Tenacity, where if you miss an attack with your Great Club, it still does damage equal to your strength modifier, so you have a minimum amount of damage that you can do with a swing, even if you miss or roll a natural 1. That's pretty useful to finish off low health enemies. The second property is Concussive Smash, which lets you, once per short rest, hit an enemy, and they have to make a con save or become dazed. Dazed prevents enemy reactions and gives them a bunch of other powerful debuffs, which gives them disadvantage on wisdom saving throws as well, and they lower their armor class, so you can land wisdom save targeting effects more easily, prevents reactions, which is very useful in honor mode, because a lot of dangerous boss effects are reactions, a lot of dangerous legendary actions. So Concussive Smash is a pretty good weapon action overall. The Great Club mostly doesn't actually have a use, though, because most characters with only simple weapon proficiency can just use a quarterstaff instead, which will typically be better, with better weapon actions overall. And any character with martial weapon proficiency can use one of the higher damaging weapons on this list, so the Great Club as a non-magical weapon is D tier. It has okay weapon actions, but it just does less damage than the other weapons in this category. The Great Sword does 2d6 of damage for an average of 7 damage, which not only is the highest base damage of any weapon in the game, it also is much less random than a lot of other weapon damage, because it's rolled on 2d6, so it's more likely to result in values in the middle of the possible range. As I say very often, the enemy of optimization is randomness. If you have more reliable damage with rolling more small dice rather than one large die, then you can plan better around how much damage your character is going to do in a given attack. So the Greatsword not only does the most damage, it does it in the best way. The Greatsword has 3 weapon actions. It has Cleave and Lacerate, just like the Greataxe, which are a mediocre weapon action and a quite good weapon action, respectively, or rather, a quite good weapon action and a mediocre weapon action, respectively. And it also has Pummel Strike. Pummel Strike takes a bonus action, meaning it can be done in the same turn as a default attack, and does a d4 plus your strength in damage, so less base damage, but still pretty decent damage because it lets you add your strength modifier, and possibly dazes the enemy. Daze, like we talked about with Concussive Smash in the Greatclub, is a pretty good debuff, and being able to apply it as a bonus action while also making a normal attack in the same turn is a pretty incredible feature of a Greatsword. A lot of fighters and barbarians and stuff don't have amazing uses for their bonus actions by default, so having a good bonus action on a given turn can be invaluable for that kind of character. You can also smite on Pummel Strike attacks as a paladin. You can smite as a reaction along the attack to get 2 smites in a turn, so it's really useful for paladins to have a Greatsword or another weapon that gives them a bonus action attack. For that reason, Greatsword is an amazing chassis for a weapon. It's one of the absolute best kinds of weapon for a weapon to be. But the non-magical Greatsword, because you can't start with it, you're unlikely to want to pick it up. It's still a very solid weapon, so if you happen to find one before you get access to any magical weapons, you'll still use it, so I'm going to give it C tier. But obviously, when you don't start with it, you'd rather just upgrade to a magical weapon as soon as possible, and you should be able to do that basically right at the beginning of the game. Finally, the Maul also does 2d6 of damage, so exactly the same properties as the Greatsword in that respect, excellent base damage, and has Tenacity and Concussive Smash, just like the Greatclub, but in addition to that, it also has Backbreaker. Backbreaker is a short rest weapon action that lets you make a normal attack, and the enemy has to make a strength save or become prone. This is basically a Battlemaster maneuver as just a normal action that your weapon gets. So it's one of the absolute most powerful weapon actions available to any weapon. Mauls, I think, have not quite the best set of weapon actions in the game, but very, very close, because all of them are very good. Tenacity makes your character much more reliable. Concussive Smash lets you disable really dangerous honor mode boss effects, and Backbreaker lets you knock enemies prone, which in Baldur's Gate is incredibly powerful. Just like the Greatsword, this is an amazing type of weapon for a weapon to be. The chassis is really good, but of course, since you don't start with one, you're unlikely to use a non-magical Maul for long, unless you just happen to find one and then be taking a fight before you find any magical weapons. C tier for the Maul, but the base stats of this weapon are really excellent. The +1 versions of these weapons are available from merchants right from the beginning of the game, and have exactly the same stats, but +1 to attack and +1 to damage. Obviously, these are pretty nice weapons because the base weapons are very good, but this is one weapon category where early merchants and early encounters will provide you with overall better or strictly superior versions of these weapons to the +1 weapons. So in my opinion, there's no need to ever buy the +1 two-handed weapons from merchants in the early game. D tier for all of these, not because they're bad, but because there are just better options available pretty much right from the start of the game. And the first of the magical weapons, the Blooded Greataxe. The Blooded Greataxe is a +1 Greataxe, so normal Greataxe, +1 to hit and damage, and when the wearer is at or below half HP, so 50% of your hit points or fewer, you do an extra d4 of slashing damage. That extra d4 of damage is obviously a pretty significant boost, but it is true that in the early game, which is when you would be considering using this axe, starting fights at half HP is definitely a real cost. Of course, you don't have to start fights at half HP in order to make use of this weapon. It's still a totally reasonable weapon to just carry around as a +1 Greataxe. It's one of the best weapons you have available at this point in the game, and then if you go below half health, you do extra damage, or you can build around starting at half health in order to get the extra damage right from the beginning of combat. The main key with the Blooded Greataxe, though, is that it is available from a merchant in the very, very early game. You can get it without any major combats, and so you can have this item basically right from the start. Since it's available so early and is just a strictly better +1 Greataxe, the Blooded Greataxe is probably the first real upgrade to your weapons that you are going to get in any given playthrough, to your two-handed weapons that you're going to get in any given playthrough. Of course, it depends on what order you take fights in and everything like that, but the Blooded Greataxe is a powerful enough weapon available early enough in the game that it's very much worth picking up if you haven't done fights that get you other weapon rewards at the point in the game where you encounter the merchant who sells it. The Blooded Greataxe, therefore, is an S-tier weapon because it does extra damage, which is exactly what you want out of a weapon. More damage is always good, and has two powerful modes, either just being a normal +1 Greataxe, which turns on if combat starts going against you, or you can use it as a weapon that does additional damage by starting combats at half HP. Great weapon because it's so early in the game. The Doom Hammer. So with a name like that, you'd expect this to be a super powerful weapon, so let's see if it holds up to the hype. The Doom Hammer is a Maul with no enhancement bonus, so attacks exactly just like a non-magical Maul. But whenever you hit an enemy with it, they receive the Bone Chill effect. Bone Chill, exactly the same as the cantrip, prevents enemy healing, and against undead, gives them disadvantage on their attack rolls. This is pretty powerful against enemies who heal, because being able to prevent their healing every turn means that the Doomhammer can effectively be doing a lot more damage than is listed on the item, because it does its normal damage plus whatever healing you're preventing in sort of effective damage. And against undead, the ability to give them constant disadvantage on their attack rolls is certainly pretty relevant, so there's a couple encounters where the Doomhammer could definitely come in. Now, generally, I'm going to prefer, when going up against characters that you want this type of effect against, to either use the Arrow of Ilmater that prevents healing, or the actual Bone Chill cantrip that prevents healing, rather than having my two-handed weapon user stuck with a suboptimal weapon, because this weapon hits less often and does less damage than other equivalent great weapons at this point in the game. But you definitely could bring it in if you lack those effects in order to gain the healing reduction or disadvantage on attack rolls for certain encounters. I think for the most part, you're pretty safe to skip this item. While the effect is pretty nice, and it does count as an effect for things like triggering for the items that care about putting effects on enemies, so triggering reverberation or radiating orb or whatever. In general, I think that the Doomhammer's effect is situational enough that you're better off just with a more generically powerful weapon. And then if you want that situational effect, there's other ways to apply it with less of an opportunity cost. I'm going to give it C tier because I think it definitely has some uses for unusual parties that can't prevent enemy healing in other ways, but most parties will be able to do that. The Everburn Blade. The Everburn Blade is a greatsword with no enhancement bonus that does an extra 1d4 of fire damage on every attack. Obviously, the extra d4 of fire damage is a pretty significant bonus. Dealing extra damage on a weapon attack is always excellent. But there is one thing in Baldur's Gate 3 that holds the Everburn Blade back, and that's the fact that any weapon can be dipped in fire and get an extra d4 of fire damage. What that means is that in practice, the Everburn Blade is not actually a damage increase compared to a normal non-magical greatsword, which you can then just dip in fire and attack with when it's burning for the same extra d4 of fire damage. Whether that matters to you is going to depend on how much micromanagement you're willing to do before combat starts. If you are always lighting all your weapons on fire or dipping them in poison or whatever before combat starts, the Everburn Blade is not going to be a good item for you because you'll be able to duplicate its effects on items with other powers. If you aren't willing to do that much micromanagement, and I don't blame you because I myself am not willing to do that much micromanagement, the Everburn Blade is a huge increase to your damage output because the extra d4 of damage on every attack is massive. So whether you're interested in this item will depend a little bit on how much you want to optimize every single action that you do in an honor mode run. Or will it? Because the Everburn Blade also has the distinction of being available right from the beginning of the game. You get it on the Nautiloid, meaning it's the first magical weapon that you encounter in the game. And remember when I said that the Greataxe was notable because it has the highest damage of any weapon you can start with? The Everburn Blade is just an upgrade over that. Great swords are better than great axes, so any two-handed weapon character is going to want to swap to the Everburn Blade just because it is a normal non-magical greatsword. So when you pick it up, it's always going to be an upgrade over your starting weapon. It's also useful for pretty much every party, because if you go straight to rescue Lae'zel, it's going to be the best weapon that you have for her, even if you are dipping your weapons in fire. You'll obviously replace it pretty quickly if you're doing that, but for pretty much every party, the Everburn Blade will still play a relevant role in combats. I'm going to give it S tier, because for players who aren't stopping before every combat to light their weapons on fire, it's a massive damage bonus, and I suspect that that is by far the more common way to play the game. And even for players who are, it's still going to be an extremely relevant item, so for pretty much every player, the Everburn Blade is still an important weapon. The Exterminator's Axe. The Exterminator's Axe is a great axe with no enhancement bonus that does an extra d6 of fire damage to plants, myconids, and small enemies. Small enemies includes a lot of enemies throughout Baldur's Gate, throughout all 3 acts, but most notably at this point in the game could include the goblins, could include various creatures that you're going to encounter in the Underdark, and so the Exterminator's Axe will actually work in a lot of encounters throughout Act 1, so the effect comes up more often than you might think. Another nice thing about this is even though it's fire damage, because it's conditional, this actually does stack with lighting the weapon on fire, so you'll be able to swing it at a goblin and get the extra d6 damage plus the extra d4 damage from dipping the Exterminator's Axe in fire, if you happen to want to do that. This is a pretty powerful bonus to your damage output. An extra d6 of damage is probably worth giving up 1 damage and 1 hit chance, depending on exactly the combat that you're in. Although it is true that the Exterminator's Axe will often overkill the types of enemies that you're going to be wanting to use it against, because goblins and such like have pretty low HP. Nevertheless, this is enough bonus damage that it is worth swapping this weapon in for the encounters where it's good, at least in Act 1, depending on the order that you play through the game, so I'm going to give it B tier because it's useful in some encounters. Next up, the Githyanki Greatsword. There's actually 2 items in the game, both called Githyanki Greatsword for some reason. There's one variety that's just a normal +1 Greatsword, and obviously that variety is just D tier, just like the normal +1 Greatsword, because it's the same and you get it later in the game. But the Githyanki Greatsword that we're talking about here is the one you loot from the Githyanki Patrol, which is a +1 Greatsword that, when wielded by a Githyanki, does an extra d4 of psychic damage. An extra d4 of psychic damage on every attack on a +1 weapon. Obviously, this is better both than the Blooded Greataxe and the Everburn Blade, which are 2 of the weapons that you'll be comparing it to at the point in the game where you get it, and so it's going to be a significant upgrade for any Githyanki character. You can also, just like all of the other items that trigger off of your character's race, trigger it by using Disguise Self to disguise as a Githyanki, and then you will do an extra d4 of psychic damage with any character, so you don't actually have to be playing a Gith in order to make use of the Githyanki Greatsword. A +1 Greatsword with an extra d4 of psychic damage on every attack is going to be just the best weapon that you have access to at this point in the game. It's going to be a strict upgrade over the Blooded Greataxe or the Everburn Blade, so obviously it's going in S tier because it just does more damage than the other weapons that you've got at this point. Next up, Hamarhraft. Hamarhraft is a Maul with no enhancement bonus, which, whenever the wearer jumps, deals 1d4 thunder damage in a 10-foot radius shockwave around where they land. This, in and of itself, is a pretty nice ability for a weapon to have, because, like I talked about, characters that are using great weapons will often not have amazing uses for their bonus actions by default, so just giving you a damaging bonus action that does AoE damage, has no hit chance or saving throw, so it always does the 1d4 damage, is pretty relevant for those characters. In addition, because it's thunder damage, this can let you apply reverberation or radiating orbs and stuff like that, so it's a very relevant damage type as well that also few enemies resist. The real use of Hamarhraft, though, in addition to just being by default a decent weapon, is that the effect is not limited to once per turn. So if you can find a way to jump multiple times in a turn, you can trigger the shockwave over and over and over again. Monks have Step of the Wind, which lets them jump without using a bonus action, so a monk using Hamarhraft can deal the shockwaves just based on their movement speed. The more movement speed you have, the more you can jump, and monks have good movement speed by default, and so you can shockwave like 20, 30 times in a turn, depending on how much you've boosted your movement speed, for enormous quantities of damage, especially when you start stacking other sources of damage riders on top of this additional damage. The other thing is that Hamarhraft actually triggers on any jump-like action. It doesn't have to be specifically the jump action. So, Eagle Barbarians can trigger this, and Flying can trigger this. Flying, similar to Step of the Wind, you can use multiple times in a turn. You can just keep using the fly action over and over again to trigger constant shockwaves. So if you have a potion of flying, the flight spell, or Illithid Flight later on in the game, you can use Hamarhraft to do absurd quantities of damage. I think the records for most damage dealt in a single turn in Baldur's Gate typically belong to this combo. With Hamarhraft plus just constantly jumping. And even on Honor Mode, where some of the damage riders have been toned down, this is still a very powerful combination. Obviously, you have to be a very specific build. A monk that uses a hammer is a kind of unusual build, but this weapon is so good when you actually use it that it's very much worth paying attention to. Just being able to turn any potion of flying into a massive nuclear bomb is pretty nice for your party, and so even if you're only using it whenever you drink a potion of flying, Hamarhraft is going to be pretty relevant. I'm going to give it A tier because it is moderately useful for every party, key for a very specific build, the Jump Monk, very niche build, and also a little bit glitchy and exploitative, because I don't think that they were really thinking that fly to trigger this 100 times in a turn was going to be the way that people used this item. But it is a very, very powerful item for those strategies, so A tier feels right to me. Next up, Jorgoral's Greatsword. This is a +1 greatsword with a name presumably designed only to be difficult to pronounce on YouTube. And it comes with a special short rest weapon action. Once per short rest, you can use Colossal Onslaught to attack everything in a 20-foot line with a 6-foot width, so a pretty gigantic AoE for a weapon attack. And that attack does normal weapon damage plus your proficiency bonus, so basically normal weapon damage with a small extra bonus. But also does half damage even if you miss on these attacks. This basically gives every melee character who's using this weapon a fireball, which is a really nice thing for a melee character to be able to access. Getting huge AoE damage on your melee characters is very relevant, especially because the types of characters that use two-handed weapons tend to be excellent at single target damage, and so giving them an AoE damage option lets them contribute even in fights where there's lots of weak enemies, and their normal attacks would be significant overkill. This is a very powerful weapon action. Obviously, there's nothing else that this weapon has going for it. It's otherwise just a completely normal +1 greatsword. But between the Colossal Onslaught and the Cleave that it comes with, this lets you specialize into doing AoE melee damage, which is a kind of fun role to be able to equip your party members with. I think it is worth swapping to Jorgoral's Greatsword in any encounter where there's a lot of weak enemies, and you can wipe out a big chunk of them all in one go with this short rest weapon action, even if normally you'd be using like the Githyanki Greatsword all of the time. Otherwise, this is good enough for some encounters that I'm going to give it A tier. It's also just a decent weapon by default because it's a +1 Greatsword with the ability to deal half damage, even on a miss, if you happen to need that, so you can finish off low health enemies, even if it's just a single target attack. Next up, the Soulbreaker Greatsword. The Soulbreaker Greatsword is a +1 Greatsword with a bunch of magical effects. Firstly, it has the same bonus as the Githyanki Greatsword, where if you're a Gith wielding it, you deal an extra d4 of psychic damage, so it's already just a very good weapon in and of itself. Next, it gives you a passive +2 to your initiative rolls. Obviously, we've been over time and again how good bonuses to your initiative are, but they're especially relevant on this weapon type, which are often used by characters that struggle with their initiative. Something like a paladin may not be able to invest as much into dexterity as another character, because paladins are highly multi-attribute dependent. And so this can patch their issues with initiative while giving them a very, very powerful weapon. In addition to that, of course, you can use this as a two-handed weapon that you can wield with an archer for just a passive +2 bonus to your initiative, because this is a passive effect. So if you have an archer who can use the Soulbreaker Greatsword, then they can get +2 to initiative from it as well, which is probably worth spending 2 hand slots on at this point in the game. Finally, the Soulbreaker Greatsword also comes with a super powerful short rest weapon action, which lets you make an attack as normal for normal damage, but add your proficiency bonus in extra damage to it, and enemies have to make a con save or become stunned for 2 turns. 2 turns of stun on just a normal weapon attack is an incredible bonus. I mean, think how good Stunning Strike on monks is, and that only stuns for 1 turn. So giving this to another character with the Soulbreaker Greatsword is incredibly powerful, even if it's only once per short rest. Any encounter where enemies fail this saving throw, you basically win immediately. And, of course, it's self-synergistic because characters using the Soulbreaker Greatsword have a bonus to initiative, so they're going to go first and stun enemies before they can take an action. This, in addition to being one of the highest damage weapons available in all of Act 1, makes the Soulbreaker Greatsword the real deal. This is going to be the best two-handed weapon in Act 1, and for many characters, it's the best two-handed weapon throughout most of the game. Only in the very, very end game, when you get legendary items, does the Soulbreaker Greatsword have any real competition, so obviously, it's going into S tier. Next up, the Sussur Greatsword. This is one of the Sussur Flower weapons, so you have to choose between this, the dagger, and the sickle. And so generally the decision that you're making is, do you have a character that can use the Sussur Greatsword? If yes, get the Greatsword. If not, get the dagger. The Sussur Greatsword is a +1 Greatsword that whenever you hit an enemy, they have to make a DC 12 con save or become silenced for 2 turns. Obviously, if you hit an enemy who is wanting to cast spells and you silence them, that's going to be incredibly powerful. And because this works on every hit, if you have a character with extra attack, you can probably make them make the saving throw at least twice in a given turn. So even though the saving throw is pretty low, the chances of silencing them are pretty decent. There's a lot of bosses as well that have legendary actions that aren't spells, but nevertheless they can't do while silenced. So for some specific tough encounters, the Sussur Greatsword can really lock down an enemy. This is just a great weapon against spellcasters and against characters who are susceptible to the silencing effect. If you have a character that can use the two-handed weapon, I recommend making the Greatsword. If you don't, I recommend making the dagger, because anybody can use that, so you can swap it in for any other melee weapon if you happen to want the effect. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier. It's going to be useful in the encounters that the effect is relevant in, and not particularly useful in the encounters that it's not, but this is one that's very much worth keeping around, and will be a pretty important tool for your party for fighting honor mode bosses and spellcasters who are vulnerable to being silenced. Svartlebee's Woundseeker. This weapon is either available in Act 2, sort of by default, you're going to find it in Act 2, but you can get it earlier in Act 1 by killing or disarming a specific NPC. There are ways to do it without aggroing that character, so you don't have to actually make any enemies in order to acquire this weapon. So Svartlebee's Woundseeker is available in Act 1 if you want it. This is a +1 Greatsword that whenever you attack an enemy that's already taken damage, you get +1d4 to your attack rolls. +1d4 to your hit chance is of course excellent, and that condition is pretty easy to meet. There's lots of ways to deal damage that don't even involve rolling to hit at all. You know, you can spend 1 magic missile from a magic missile on getting the enemy slightly chipped in their health in order to trigger the attack roll. As a +1 Greatsword, this already is a reasonably damaging weapon, and accuracy is really, really important, especially for the types of enemies that this would be good against, and for the types of characters that would be using this weapon. A lot of characters with great weapons are going to have Great Weapon Master for -5 to hit and +10 damage, so bonuses to hit are especially valuable for them because their hits hit so hard and are less likely to hit by default, so you want to mitigate that. Svartlebee's Woundseeker is pretty nice if you are going into combat with enemies with high armor class, so they're hard to hit, and lots of hit points, so that the fight will go long enough for you to get a lot of benefit out of the bonus, and you're not just going to one-shot them with an attack from a normal weapon. So this is definitely one that you can sub in for certain encounters, or just use by default, because it's a pretty powerful weapon in and of itself, if you're willing to spend some time with your other characters, or find ways to set up the hit chance bonus. If you find this weapon in Act 2, you probably shouldn't care about it at all. By Act 2, you're going to have better options. But if you get it early in Act 1, there's a lot of fights where Svartlebee's Woundseeker is going to be nice because the bonus hit chance is very relevant. I'm going to give it A tier because it's mostly for boss fights, and it's not as generically applicable as the S tier weapons, but this is still a very powerful option to have in your arsenal. Next up, the Sword of Justice. The Sword of Justice is a +1 greatsword that, once per short rest, allows you to cast Shield of Faith as a bonus action. Shield of Faith is a concentration spell that gives you +2 to your armor class. Now, a lot of characters that are using great weapons don't care about their concentration. They have no other use for this, so the fact that this is concentration is not a downside, and even in some cases is an upside if you have like Concentrated Blast from your Illithid powers, or are using the ring that gives you bonus damage while concentrating on a spell. And +2 to your armor class is a pretty real bonus for these characters when it's effectively free. You're also not bad at maintaining concentration on these characters, because you'll have high armor class and probably proficiency in constitution saves as well, meaning that you can maintain the tier's protection very easily, and even if it goes down, it comes back on a short rest, so you can consistently use this effect to basically just have a sword that gives you permanent +2 to your armor class. A +1 greatsword with a permanent +2 to your armor class is a pretty excellent weapon, especially because it's available very early in the game. You have to do one quite difficult fight to get it, but once you've done that fight, you have a really nice weapon. So basically the question is, are you using this weapon available very early in the game, or are you using the Blooded Greataxe? The Blooded Greataxe doesn't require a fight and does more damage, so for more offensively oriented characters is better. And the Sword of Justice does require you to go through one battle and is better for more, and does less damage, but makes your character more protected. So for more defensively oriented characters, it's better. I'm going to give it S tier as well, because I think that different builds want both of these weapons, and the Sword of Justice is a very powerful weapon to have in the early game. There's a lot of builds that make use of this. Also, just on a generic like Battlemaster fighter or anything like that, it's going to be very useful because increasing those characters' armor class is incredibly relevant in the early game, especially when enemies might not have the hit chance to hit their newly powered up armor class. You'll eventually swap out of this weapon when you get higher damaging weapons like the Githyanki Greatsword, and for a barbarian you probably prefer the Blooded Greataxe or a character who's intending to start at half HP, but the Sword of Justice is a very, very important early game weapon, and one that you should prioritize getting if you have a character that can use it. And finally, for Act 1 weapons, the Very Heavy Greataxe. The Very Heavy Greataxe, I do love the name, because it is actually very heavy. It's 3 times as heavy as any other Greataxe, which is very funny to me. It's a +1 Greataxe with a special weapon action. This weapon action has an awful lot of words, but basically it's identical to the normal cleave weapon action that any Greataxe comes with, allowing you to attack up to 3 characters in a small AoE for half damage. But when you use this weapon action, you deal an extra d6 of damage per target, and gain the off-balance condition. Except not the actual off-balance condition, a different off-balance condition unique to this weapon that's also called off-balance. It's sort of inexplicable to me that they named 2 different conditions the identical thing, but that's exactly where we are. And what this one does is, for 1 turn, whenever an enemy hits you, you have to make a saving throw or fall prone. The ability to make a weapon action
a short rest weapon action that's just available by default to any weapon of this category with a massive penalty is not something that particularly excites me about this weapon. So while it is funny, it's also terrible. And it annoys me that the condition is called the same thing as another condition with a completely different effect. So, into the trash can with the very heavy Greataxe for a number of reasons. D tier. So, at the end of Act 1, one thing that's kind of fun about the two-handed weapons is that you've actually had a pretty smooth progression of item upgrades. A lot of characters get one weapon upgrade sometime in Act 1 and never change their weapons again, but for two-handed weapon users, you've gone from the Everburn Blade to the Blooded Greataxe or the Sword of Justice to the Githyanki Greatsword to the Soulbreaker Greatsword in a pretty smooth progression across the act, which is fun to me. Characters at the end of Act 1 will almost certainly be using the Soulbreaker Greatsword. It's the best of these weapons, although Hamarhraft, of course, for characters that are abusing its effects is still very relevant. Jorgoral's Greatsword can still come in for battles with lots of small enemies, and the Sussur Greatsword is still very useful against spellcasters, but for the most part, it's very difficult to beat the Soulbreaker Greatsword, which just gives you such a powerful set of bonuses for this point in the game that you're very much going to want to use it. Moving on to Act 2, this weapon category continues the trend of Act 2 having very, very few weapons in it, with only 4 of them showing up in Act 2. The first of these is the Argument Solver. This is a +1 Great Club. Although, unlike the normal Greatclub, it actually has the default weapon actions of the Maul, so it gives you tenacity, concussive smash, and backbreaker, unlike the default Greatclub. And whenever you hit an enemy with it, it deals extra poison damage equal to your proficiency bonus. That's probably +3 at this point in the game. It'll go up to +4 later on. So that's a decent amount of additional damage per attack, but still does not bring it up to the damage of other two-handed weapons available. In addition to that, though, whenever you hit an enemy, it creates a cloud of poison around them, which they have to then make a DC 11 Constitution save or become poisoned, which is a pretty neat effect, especially if you yourself are immune to poison, so you can fight in these large clouds of poison that you're going to be creating with impunity. The low damage and low save DC on the Argument Solver unfortunately makes it not very good at this point in the game. A lot of enemies are also immune to poison, but there's definitely some neat things going on with this weapon. Being able to cover the battlefield in poison clouds does have a certain appeal. So I'm going to give it C tier because I think mostly it's fairly weak, but it is cool enough that you could probably do some themed builds around it with the various poison gear in order to take advantage of this effect and get a pretty neat character out of that. The Defender Greataxe is a +2 Greataxe that whenever you make your first attack in a round, you can choose to reduce the bonus by 1 to make it a +1 Greataxe for that attack, in order to gain 1 to your AC and saving throws. So if you use this ability every round, it's basically a +1 axe that gives you a bonus of 1 to your AC and saving throws, which isn't a terrible bonus. But it also gives you the option, and more options is always good because it lets you adapt to the circumstances of the encounter. That being said, this is a two-handed weapon with a defensive bonus, which is just not that exciting. Two-handed weapons are about doing the most possible damage that you can. If you wanted a defensive bonus on a weapon, then you should probably have just given that character a shield and a one-handed weapon instead. If you're still using the Sword of Justice at this point for some reason, then the bonus to saves is probably better than the bonus to armor class, so you might swap, but you most likely won't still be using it. This weapon also has the problem that it's a saving throw bonus that you don't have at the start of combat, which is when saving throws are most important. If you lose initiative and enemies hit you with a control spell before you get to go, that's the worst time for that to happen, and the Defender Greataxe doesn't help with that because you won't have attacked yet. So overall, I think that this item just doesn't have a place. There aren't really characters that would want the Defender Greataxe, because any character that's using a two-handed weapon is going to be better off with one that does more damage, and a character that wants these defensive bonuses has better options with other types of gear. So D tier for the Defender Greataxe. Next up, the Punch Drunk Bastard. The Punch Drunk Bastard is a +1 Greatclub, though weirdly enough it gives you completely different weapon actions than a normal Greatclub. It gives you concussive smash, which a Greatclub normally has, Backbreaker, which a Maul normally has, and Cleave, allowing you to attack in an AoE, which a Greataxe or Greatsword normally have. So it's a pretty eclectic set of short rest weapon actions, but a pretty powerful one overall. In addition to that, while you're drunk, you have advantage on every single attack, which is pretty powerful. Advantage on all your attacks is really, really nice. And just being able to get that relatively easily. Drunk takes a bonus action to trigger, usually, to drink any alcohol. But then in Act 3, you will also find alcohol that doesn't take any action to drink, so you'll be able to get drunk without having to spend any time on it at all. You can insert your jokes in the comments as you like. And being able to make every attack with advantage is obviously very powerful. Hitting your attacks more often is especially good for Great Weapon Master characters who do bonus damage on every attack. In addition to that, while you're drunk, whenever you hit an enemy, you create a 10-foot radius shockwave for 1d4 thunder damage. Making a giant AoE blast of thunder damage on every attack is really good for a bunch of reasons. 1, this is also just extra damage on every attack. 2, it's thunder damage, so it can proc reverberation. And 3, it's AoE damage, so it can proc reverberation in an area of effect. This is especially good for because this weapon has Cleave by default, so if you hit 3 enemies with it, not only do each of them take a d4 of thunder damage from the effect triggering, each of them take 3d4 of thunder damage because they're all within 10 feet of each other, so they all take the damage from each of them getting hit. That also stacks reverberation up to maximum instantly, meaning that the Punch Drunk Bastard is one of the best ways in the game to apply a ton of reverberation stacks. Pairs especially well with a Tiger Barbarian who can make effectively Cleave attacks every round, but because this weapon actually comes with Cleave itself, you don't have to use it on a Tiger Barbarian to get the effect. This is actually a really good weapon if you are a drunk build, drinking every turn, and it by itself enables a build that drinks alcohol, that stays constantly drunk, to be a pretty powerful effect. Obviously, this is a very specific build. You have to have reverberation gear in order to get the most out of the thunder damage, and you have to be constantly drunk in order to get the effects of the actual weapon. But for that build, it is a very good weapon, so I'm going to give it A tier. And we're already at the last of the Act 2 weapons, the Rat Bat. The Rat Bat is a +1 Greatclub. Though unlike other Greatclubs, it only comes with Concussive Smash, it doesn't have Tenacity, so they really messed up the weapon actions for Greatclubs, which all have completely different weapon actions. But the Rat Bat is a +1 Greatclub that whenever you gives you advantage on attacks against beasts, and whenever you hit an enemy with it, it does an extra d6 of piercing damage. This piercing damage, by the way, not listed anywhere on the tooltip for this item, but it does do the extra piercing damage because it's a bat with nails in it. The Rat Bat is notable for 2 reasons. 1, a d8 plus a d6 on a +1 Greatclub, or a plus d6 on a +1 Greatclub, is not bad damage if you are a two-handed weapon user that doesn't have martial weapon proficiency. So if you can't use, for example, the Soulbreaker Greatsword, because you only have simple weapon proficiency, then the Rat Bat may be your best option for damage. The second reason is that extra d6 of damage is incredibly buggy. This is another one of the items that on Tactician mode or below has a damage effect that is both itself a damage rider and a damage rider source, meaning other damage riders get trigger off of the Rat Bat bonus d6 of damage. So if you have Great Weapon Master, for example, you do the +10 damage on that you would normally do, plus an extra +10 damage on the extra d6 of piercing damage that you would do. Any rings or whatever that you have that do extra damage, rings or gloves or whatever, also apply their bonus damage additionally, making the Rat Bat one of the items that is absolutely broken in Tactician or below because it does wildly more damage than it's supposed to, since it doubles up on every single damage, additional damage effect that you have. The Rat Bat, I think, is actually unique in that it works with even some damage riders that other damage rider items don't. So I think this item is the one that makes, on Tactician or below, weapon attacks with the highest theoretical damage output in the game. if you want to get into abusing every bug that's in the game in terms of Tactician or below. I'm not going to rate it based on that metric, but it's worth mentioning that this item on lower difficulties is super buggy and does wildly too much damage. For Honor Mode, it's C tier because it's only useful if you need a two-handed weapon that does damage, but can't use one of the better two-handed martial weapons, and also don't have access to the legendary spears and stuff yet that you get around the same time. So the Rat Bat mostly doesn't have a place in Honor Mode playthroughs, just in YouTube compilations where you do 10,000 damage in a single attack. The +2 Greataxe I've listed here because the only place I know that you can find one is in Act 3, but it's possible it shows up in random merchant inventories. Weirdly, there's no +2 versions of these other weapons, only Greataxe, but obviously by this point you have better weapons anyways, so D tier for the +2 Greataxe. And we're leading off Act 3 with the first legendary weapon from this category, the Balduran's Giantslayer. Balduran's Giantslayer is a +3 greatsword with a bunch of magical effects. The first is that when this weapon applies double your strength modifier in damage. Obviously, this is incredible. Characters that want to use two-handed weapons will have high strength, and mostly just want to do a bunch of damage, so adding a ton of extra damage to every attack is great. And in Baldur's Gate 3, strength is really easy to raise to staggeringly high levels because the Cloud Giant Elixirs let you get a +8 bonus to your strength, which doubles to +16 when you're using the Balduran's Giantslayer. In addition to that, you get advantage on attack rolls against large, huge, and gargantuan enemies, so some of the more powerful enemies in the game, you get advantage on all your attack rolls against. You can cast a souped-up version of Enlarge once per short rest, giving you a bunch of temporary hit points and a bunch of extra damage on every one of your attacks. And you get a special short rest weapon action that lets you deal a bunch of extra damage to large or greater sized enemies, and they have to make a strength save or fall prone. Now, they often won't they'll often pass this strength save because huge enemies tend to have good strength saving throws. But still, this weapon is a +3 weapon at base that does way more damage than any other weapon in this category because it lets you double your strength bonus, gives you a bunch of additional damage options, and advantage on attacks against the most relevant enemies. All of these things together mean that it is just the best and most damaging weapon for two-handed weapon users in the game. It's a legendary endgame weapon, and it, of course, fills the role of legendary endgame weapon very well. Every two-handed weapon user is going to be hoping to grab this item. S tier, of course, for Balduran's Giantslayer. The Corpsegrinder. The Corpsegrinder is a +2 Maul that deals an additional D4 thunder damage on every attack. Which is good for all the reasons that dealing extra thunder damage is always good. For reverberation, it's just a good damage type. Extra damage is, of course, what you want on a weapon. In addition to that, once per short rest, you can slam it into the ground, dealing a normal weapon attack to everything within 10 feet of you, which is a pretty powerful AoE effect. Just like Jorgoral's Greatsword, the Corpsegrinder basically gives you a mini fireball on your melee characters, which is a nice thing to have access to. Then those characters have to make a saving throw, otherwise they get shoved away, and that distance they get shoved is based on your normal shove distance. So if you have pretty high strength, then you can send enemies flying with this attack. Now, shoving enemies away that you've just done a bunch of AoE damage to, you can certainly set this up to be useful. If you position your character correctly, you can push them off of cliffs, into hazards, etc. But often this will also move enemies away from your melee fighter, which isn't necessarily something that you want. So you have to be a little careful with the positioning. But basically, this is a solid weapon with a decent damage type and a relevant ability. Most characters, I think, are still going to prefer the Soulbreaker at the point that this weapon is available, but it's certainly not a bad weapon. B tier for the Corpsegrinder. The Foebreaker is a +2 Maul that ignores resistance to bludgeoning damage. In general, if an enemy has bludgeoning resistance, I feel like it's better to bypass it with a good weapon, and just use either a different kind of weapon, like a slashing weapon, if they have bludgeoning but not slashing resistance, or damage riders like things from rings, character abilities, or whatever, because most characters will have a lot of different damage types per attack, rather than try to swap to the Foebreaker in order to overcome its bludgeoning resistance. I can't really think of an encounter where an enemy has resistances that we need to overcome, where the Foebreaker is going to be better than the other weapons that we have available. Resistance, obviously, is a fairly painful condition, but there's better ways, I think, to overcome it. So, in general, I just don't think the Foebreaker has any encounters where it's relevant, and I'm going to give it D tier. If there's one where you think the Foebreaker is particularly useful, I guess let me know in the comments, because maybe I'm just forgetting an encounter where this could have an effect. But for the most part, I think you can safely ignore this weapon. Next up, the Hellfire Greataxe. The Hellfire Greataxe is a +2 Greataxe that does an extra d6 of fire damage on every attack, and whenever you deal damage with the weapon, you gain 2 turns of heat. Heat deals burning damage to you every turn. You take a d4 of damage every turn, but then you can spend the heat to deal additional damage on your next attack, equal to the amount of heat that you've stacked up. So basically, it deals 2 extra damage on every attack, but you can split up that damage as appropriate given the attacks that you actually need, the amounts of damage that you actually need on a given turn. In addition to that, it also, once per short rest, lets you use Hellflame Cleave, which is an incredibly powerful AoE ability. This is an AoE attack that does normal weapon damage plus 2d6 fire damage, so already really good, because that's actually plus 3d6 fire damage with the Hellfire Greataxe. You can expend your heat for a bunch of bonus damage in an AoE here, and then it leaves behind an area of Hellfire on the ground. Enemies in Hellfire take 6d6 fire damage every turn, and have a chance, they have to make a dex save or become lit on Hellfire, where they take an extra 6d6 fire damage every turn. So this can be an unreal amount of damage, because enemies take 66 fire damage from being in it. That's six-sided dice, not 66, as in 6-6, by the way. And then also can take an extra 6d6 fire damage, if they get lit on fire. For a once per short rest action, this basically wins every encounter that you cast it in, because it's a huge amount of AoE damage. There's also some weirdness with this ability, because it's actually classified as a cantrip, which means a couple funny things. For one thing, you can quicken spell it, so a sorcerer can use the Hellfire Greataxe even if they're never attacking with it to cast Hellflame Cleave as a spell, as a bonus action, and a bunch of other weird interactions that come from this being a spell rather than a weapon action. For whatever reason, that's how it's coded. The huge amount of damage that the Hellfire Greataxe does every time you activate its ability means that this is the best AoE damage weapon in the game for a two-handed weapon user, and probably the best AoE damage effect in the game that you can just use every short rest. So basically, the Hellfire Greataxe is incredible for any character that wants AoE damage, or any encounter where you want area of effect damage. The basic question is it better than Balduran's Giantslayer? And the answer is, for combats against lots of enemies, it is. For combats against large enemies or single enemies, the Giantslayer is better. Either way, the Hellfire Greataxe does a ludicrous amount of damage, and is going into S tier. Next up, Sethan, or Sethan, I don't know. According to the wiki, this is a JoJo reference, but I haven't seen it, so I'm sure everyone will correct my pronunciation in the comments. Sethan is a +2 Greataxe with 2 abilities. Firstly, it lets you cast Spiritual Weapon only for a Greataxe at 6th level, once per long rest. A 6th level Spiritual Weapon is pretty good. It has a decent amount of hit points and does 3 d8 damage on every attack, so it can distract some enemies, and as a bonus action that you can cast once per long rest, it's not terrible. It also lets you cast Reduce, allowing you to shrink yourself or an ally, which is useful, I guess, in sort of out-of-combat exploration. You can potentially land it on an enemy if they fail the saving throw, but the save is only a DC 11 con save, so nothing is actually going to fail the saving throw, and you have way better uses of inaction than trying to reduce an enemy. For the most part, a +2 Greataxe that gives you a moderately relevant bonus action spell once per long rest is something that you could maybe swap in to use the Spiritual Greataxe effect. And so I'm going to give it C tier because I think that is a powerful enough ability that if you're really, really hurting for long rest resources, you could swap in Sethan. But generally speaking, you'd rather just use a more powerful weapon than have the spiritual Greataxe effect, I think. Because while that can absorb a hit or two, you'll just be taking more hits than if you killed enemies much faster with a different weapon. The Silver Sword of the Astral Plane. The Silver Sword of the Astral Plane has a super long name, which is very annoying when I'm trying to make the icons for this tier list. Now, firstly, I should say that it is possible to get this weapon in Act 1. There's a couple exploits that you can do to allow you to disarm Voss of this weapon and acquire it in Act 1. Larian has made a couple attempts to patch this out, so I don't think it's intended behavior, but as of time of recording, it's still possible using a couple methods. You can look those up on the wiki if you're interested. Obviously, if you get this legendary +3 Greatsword in Act 1, it's going to be S tier, because it's way before you're supposed to have access to this weapon, and is going to be wildly overpowered for the encounters that you're facing. I'm more interested in rating it when you're supposed to get this weapon in Act 3. This is a +3 Greatsword with a couple magical effects. Firstly, if you're a Githyanki, it does an extra d6 of psychic damage, which is a decent amount of additional damage. And if you're a Githyanki, you have advantage on mental saving throws, so intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, resistance to psychic damage, and immunity to charm. This is super useful when fighting characters that make you make mental saving throws, because advantage on those saves is always nice. And the types of character that want a big two-handed weapon often suffer in terms of mental saving throws, so advantage on those is very useful if you're a fighter or a barbarian or whatever. In addition, it gives you the Soulbreaker stun action, same as the Soulbreaker Greatsword. Enemies have to make a saving throw or become stunned for 2 turns. As a +3 Greatsword that does a bunch of extra damage on every attack, this obviously is a very good weapon for a Githyanki or a character disguised as a Githyanki. And the bonus on saving throws is really, really nice for any character that is that wants to use two-handed weapons. The Soulbreaker weapon action is very good. Of course, it's just as good as it was on the Soulbreaker Greatsword, although less impactful because it shows up later in the game. The real question here is the Silver Sword better than Balduran's Giantslayer or the Hellfire Greataxe? And in my opinion, the answer is mostly no. The Hellfire Greataxe does incredible AoE damage, and so is really useful for that. And the Giantslayer does incredible single target damage, and is really useful for that. Whereas the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane, it falls more as a sort of defensive weapon, still does great damage and hits super accurately, but by the time you're getting the legendary sort of high-level weapons in Act 3, I think that you are better off with one of the other 2 endgame weapons. I'm going to give this A tier, because if you have a character that is struggling with their saving throws, the Silver Sword is going to be excellent for that character, and obviously this weapon is so powerful that you can never go wrong equipping it, but I think it is slightly overshadowed by the other 2 endgame weapons, the Giantslayer and the Hellfire Greataxe. The Sword of Chaos. The Sword of Chaos is a +2 Greatsword that deals an extra d4 of necrotic damage on every attack, so it's got decent damage, and heals you for a d6 of hit points on every attack. This is a pretty decent amount of sustain, because if you are attacking multiple times per turn, then you're going to be healing quite a bit on every turn, and also has a lot of synergy with other effects. For one thing, if you are a character that attacks in an AoE, then you're going to get this healing on every attack that you hit. So a Sword Bard that's making AoE attacks, a Tiger Barbarian that's making AoE attacks, or just any character using the default cleave action of this weapon, because it's a greatsword, so it comes with cleave, is going to get multiple d6s of healing from every attack. If you are a character that multiplies your hit points, like a Bear Totem Barbarian, those d6s of healing are worth more, because they're worth twice as much if you're taking half as much damage from every attack. So this can give you a lot of sustain for certain builds. In addition, of course, it triggers effects that care about healing yourself, because this does count as healing yourself. So it's going to work with the buff on heal items and other effects that care about self-healing for some pretty interesting synergies with a bunch of items. I think for a lot of characters, this is going to be like the second best weapon that they could have, but this does enable a bunch of cool synergistic builds. So I'm going to give it A tier, because I think that the Sword of Chaos is overall a quite interesting weapon that enables unique strategies, and also just isn't bad as a pretty solid default pick for any character that can use it. And finally, the Undead Bane. The Undead Bane is a +1 Greataxe that deals an extra d6 of damage against fiends and undead, and once per short rest, lets you deal 2d6 additional damage against those targets, and bane them if they fail a saving throw. Bane is a pretty minor effect to apply, so mostly this is a short rest weapon action to deal an extra 2d6 of damage, but against the types of enemies that you'd be bringing this weapon in, that you'd be equipping this weapon in order to fight. There are a decent number of dangerous encounters with fiends and undead in Act 3, though obviously this is less useful than if it showed up in earlier acts. And the bonus that you get, I think, is not that strong compared to the other bonus weapon damage, the other weapons that just have bonus damage. I mean, compare this to the Soulbreaker Greatsword, you're getting a d6 of extra damage instead of a d4 of extra damage against fiends and undead, but otherwise it's just a worse weapon overall with no initiative bonus, and the short rest weapon action for 2d6 damage is worse than the short rest weapon action for stunning. So even in the encounters that this weapon is intended to be used in, I just don't think it's particularly strong. D tier because the generically powerful weapons are just better than this specialist weapon, even in the things that it's specialized in. So, at the end of Act 3, characters focused on single target damage will be using Balduran's Giantslayer, and characters focused on AoE damage will be using the Hellfire Greataxe. The Silver Sword of the Astral Plane can be useful for a character that needs the saving throw bonuses, but otherwise I think I prefer one of these other two weapons, and the Sword of Chaos is useful for healing builds. The Punch Drunk Bastard is still great for the Drunk Reverberation build, though obviously that's only a very specific build that we'll be using that. Finally, characters that are struggling with their initiative, there's no shame in just keeping the Soulbreaker Greatsword all game. +2 initiative is a huge bonus, and while you give up some damage, sometimes that's just required to make the build work, and so the Soulbreaker Greatsword is just really good for those characters, even on into the endgame. But for the most part, it's going to be one of these two weapons that your two-handed weapon characters are using. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the two-handed weapons, the highest damage weapon category in Baldur's Gate 3, and I hope you found it helpful for planning out your honor mode runs and planning your build. As always, if you think that there's something that I missed about one of these weapons, or I misplaced one of them in a category, definitely do let me know in the comments. I'm always open to good arguments as to why I should move stuff around, and we've definitely done that in the past when people have pointed out things that I have missed about these weapons, so don't be afraid if your opinion, to express your opinion and tell me why you think I should move something around. Of course, if you have enjoyed the video, then please feel free to leave a comment and hit like, helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I do really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists. We are almost through with the weapons. We're getting there, which has been a truly epic project, and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.